All right, good evening, one and all. Welcome to Meaningful Jewish Living's second session on Shabbat, the Jewish day of rest, rules, and Cholent. This is our exploration of Shabbat. And as I explained last week, the title is very deliberate. In addition to being things that we all love, certainly rest and Cholent, rules maybe not as much, but last week we spoke about rest and the celebration of Shabbat, what we call the dues and the experience of Shabbat. This week we're going to look at the rules, the don'ts, the obligations of Shabbat. The negatives, but really the observances of Shabbat, what makes one Shomer Shabbat. And we're also going to be speaking about next week, Cholent. We talked about how that will be more of an exploration of, sort of a practical how-to. We'll review a lot of the pieces connecting to Shabbat. So as we get started, I'm going to post into the chat some sources for this evening. The link is right there. You should be able to pretty easily access it. And this will allow us to get underway. As is the case, if you have questions throughout, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand or shout or do whatever it is you do to get noticed when you're on Zoom these days. And we'll get underway. So to sum up what we saw last week, Shabbat certainly has a celebration, has a spiritual component, it has an enjoyment component. The enjoyment component does come with observances and rules. At the same time, most of what we saw last week were the fun parts of Shabbos. Who doesn't like Kiddush? Who doesn't like a Shabbos snap? Who doesn't like meals? Who doesn't like songs? Who doesn't like spirituality? No one wants to admit that. But we covered the role that Shabbat plays in becoming what is the prototypical Jewish observance. It's really an extension of our faith. It's an extension of our relationship with God. It gives us some insight into our religious experiences and our religious obligations. Shabbat, is really the total package. At the core are the religious obligations of Shabbat, the deeds, the actions, which may not necessarily be as understandable or as popular, but they're certainly as crucial. And that is what we're talking about this year, the rules. And we're going to get into the discussion of the rules by looking at what's called milacha. Milacha, translated as, we'll see in source number 1. When you talk about some of the things we don't do on Shabbat, people always say, you don't cook, you don't use electricity, right? These are all concepts that need to be explored. And we started with looking at milacha. So in the source sheets, we're going through Roman numeral number 1, which is the idea that part of Shabbat is the fact that we control the week instead of the week controlling us. And let's look at that by looking at source number 1 from Exodus, which within the discussion of the commandment of Shabbat. Let's take a look. Sheshet yamin ta'avod v'yasita kol malachtecha. So you'll work for 6 days and do all of your malacha. V'yom hashvi Shabbat l'Hashem Elokecha. 7th day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. Lo ta'aseh kol malacha. Don't do malacha. Ata v'incha v'techa avdecha v'amatcha v'hemtecha v'gercha shevisharecha. And this includes you, your son, your daughter, your slave, your maid, your animal, the foreigner, and your gates. So during the week we do malacha, and on Shabbat we don't do malacha. So what is malacha? Sometimes it's translated as work, sometimes it's translated as labor. In a sense, there are categories of things that we don't do. And we have to recognize that it's not about exertion, it's not about effort. Look at source number 2, Rabbi Chaim ben Attar, or HaChaim, his commentary on the Torah in this area. And he rested on the 7th day. There are 39 forbidden malachot, including some that involve no exertion at all. For example, carrying an object from a private to a public area, or vice versa, or many other examples. A person might ask, what exertion is there in this? Therefore, the verse says, 6 days God created and he rested. This teaches you that this has nothing to do with exertion, for it is written regarding God. He does not get tired or exhausted. It's not about work. It's not about exertion. It's about a certain level of activity. And we generally look to certain categories or certain models to give us what are those categories of work that we do not engage in. One has to do with the fact that God rested. God was involved in creation of heaven and earth throughout the 6 days. So sometimes it's creative activity. And that's what was meant when we talked about the fact that during the week, we engage in activities which show that we're in charge. Right? That on Shabbat, we step back and let nature take its course. The world that we create on Shabbat, the 6 days of the week, on Shabbat, we step back and let it run its course without our interference. And so that's an important part of this idea that on some level, it's creative activity. Now, remember, creative activity can be singing and can be speaking also, but the idea of creative activity are generally the things that we do that help us go from point A to point B during the week. Point A to point B could be the way that we move from place to place. From point A to point B can be the activities we engage in to make money. From point A to point B can be how we prepare our food. There are all sorts of steps that are involved in going from point A to point B that, at least on the surface from our presentation here, don't do it, right? 6 days you do it. On the 7th day, you don't do it. In a certain way, if you do it during the week, you shouldn't be doing it on Shabbat. That's a blanket statement, and it's not fully an accurate statement, but it begins the conversation as if you're doing it during the week, you shouldn't really necessarily do it on Shabbat. And we'll see that extend and expand as we move forward into this conversation. And again, if there are questions, we could address those as well. So we control the week. On Shabbat, we step back and remove ourselves from the equation. And what we've generally been doing during the week, we step back from and don't do on Shabbat. So what about some specifics? How do we? It's a nice concept that we step back from the week, from our domination or dominion over what we encounter. But where do we get the examples from? So what kind of work? It's tabernacle work. Tabernacle, in Hebrew, the Mishkan, which was what was built by the Jewish people in the desert as a sanctuary, as a portable sanctuary. So we read when it comes to the construction of this tabernacle, Roman numeral number 2, Malbim, Rabbi Meir Leibish, one of the commentaries on the Torah, discussing the verses in the Torah where the tabernacle is discussed, by saying that work on those activities involved in the construction of the Mishkan must cease on Shabbat. The Torah implies that any activity involved in the construction of the tabernacle is considered melacha. Right? If we discuss the concept in our first couple of sources and this idea of stepping back from the week and what we normally do during the week, we don't do on Shabbat. If we're trying to add some meat to those bones and understand what the overall picture is, if we want to be more specific, the tabernacle is a good place to start. The fact that the tabernacle was not constructed, the activity involved in the tabernacle was not done on Shabbat. This tells us that whatever they would have been doing in that tabernacle construction is what we cannot do on Shabbat. And this is where we get to the idea that these are the categories of work. Roman numeral number 3, there are 39 categories of work. As the Talmud says in the Mishnah in Shabbat, Roman numeral 3, source 1, Avot melacha arba'im chaser achat. It's 40 minus 1. Interesting, the Talmud likes to use that example several different times. 40 minus 1. It could just say 39. But it likes the expression 40 minus 1. In source number 2, we have a list of all of those 39. Now, except maybe if you're in a Jewish day school and there's some sort of Jewish knowledge competition, most people, the average Joe, doesn't really know them all by heart. So don't feel that you're going to be ever called upon to list all of them. I cannot list them all by heart. Yeah, even the rabbi can't list them all by heart. So you don't have to worry about listing them all by heart. But you see that there, you can find them in different books about Shabbat, the laws of Shabbat by Eider, the 39 Melachot by Ribiat. There are all sorts of places to go to find a listing. And many of them at first glance will seem irrelevant to us practically, but these were all categories of things which activities that were necessary in the preparation and construction of the Mishkan of the tabernacle. So the first 11 were performed for making the loaves of bread for the weekly showbread offering, right? What kind of house of worship, a sacred space in Judaism would it be if they didn't serve food, right? So they didn't serve kiddush, but they did have food. They had showbread. And you see, it's not just the cooking. It's the plowing and the sowing and the reaping and the gathering and the threshing and the winnowing and the selecting and the grinding and the sifting and the kneading and the baking. And it's not just about food. So, for example, there's a discussion that one really is not supposed to make mud on Shabbat. You're not supposed to take dry earth and mix it with water. You're probably thinking to yourself, that's all fine and good because I don't really make mud ever. But it is the idea. You can imagine if you're playing with certain types of Play-Doh, you're not allowed to make Play-Doh for kids on Shabbat. There's certain real world applications for a lot of these things that we're not always thinking of. So, for example, it talks about selecting, right? And the selecting is when you would separate the wheat from the chaff, right? Once you harvest your wheat, you have to separate the wheat from the chaff before you can grind it, before you can use it as flour, before you can mix it with the water, before you can bake it. But so sorting develops into a much larger idea in Jewish law that you're not allowed to separate the bad from the good. On Shabbat, you're not allowed to separate. You're not allowed to separate bad from good. Oh, big deal, right? Well, who likes watermelon, right? Everybody likes watermelon. Well, if you want to take the seeds out of the watermelon, you have to be careful because picking out seeds is taking out the bad from the good. You may say, well, I stick it in my mouth and spit out the seeds. Okay, that could work. But if you want to go picking out the seeds, you can't pick out the bad from the good. What you are allowed to do is take the good from the bad, or you can take out the bad as long as you take out a little bit of the good. You scoop out the watermelon seeds with a spoon, as long as you remove a little bit of watermelon at the same time. Now, some of you may be thinking, what I'm thinking is that haven't you really noticed that most watermelon, they sell a lot more seedless watermelon today, right? That must be the Jewish lobby. But it's, there certainly is modern technology and products certainly make some parts of Shabbat easier. And we talked a little bit about this last week. Also, the choice of Jewish foods. For example, gefilte fish. Gefilte fish, and by the way, there's a great clip of Gal Gadot having Jimmy Fallon try gefilte fish. He actually kind of likes it. She does not. He does. But the gefilte fish emerged as the idea that fish, if you normally take fish, whatever fish you would have fresh, salmon, whitefish, carp, etc., if you want to eat it, you have to take the bones out. And taking the bones out would be taking the bad from the good. You can't do that. So it could get very complicated. Or gefilte fish is maybe you put the whole fish in the grinder, you grind it all up, bones and all. And therefore, not only maybe is it more economical, but you avoid this Shabbat technical issue as well. And so here is a culinary choice on Shabbat that works out well because it obviates a certain problematic area of Jewish law that you would encounter if you were trying to take the bones out of the fish that you're eating. So this is just an example of the fact that, as Malbim said, if it was involved in the tabernacle, it becomes a problem for Shabbat. And even on the surface, we don't think we would encounter it the same way. It still is something to think about. We turn now to page 2 of the sources, where we come to the next 13. The next 13 categories of malacha are related to the processing of woolen materials used in the Mishkan. Right? They had a lot of animal skins and a lot of cloth material that had to be woven and prepared and finished and dyed, right, with D-Y-E. So you have everything about that, right? It starts with the shearing, right? How do you get it off the animal? You have to shear it. So you're not allowed to do any shearing or bleaching or combing or dyeing or spinning or weaving. All sorts of different types of weaving processes that were part of it. Some of it has to do with using the loom. Some of it has to do with using needles. And that's where you see that there are four in particular, that are all parts of the weaving process. Tying a knot, untying a knot, sewing, and tearing in order to sew. This idea of not tearing, right? I mentioned last week that we would, we'd explore some of these in particular. My colleague once was teaching, was on a Shabbaton, a weekend retreat for Jewish students. And the topic was, do you enjoy Shabbat? And one of the students was a little bit, turned off by observance. I said, yeah, Shabbat, that's all, we just don't tear toilet paper for 25 hours, right? You're getting that from here, this idea of tearing. As we'll see, tearing in order to sew. So maybe if you tear toilet paper, you're not going to put it back together afterwards. Maybe it's not as problematic. But so all of these things went into the production, the manufacture, the processing, the preparation of all of the materials that were used as walls and is used as curtains and is used as partitions in the tabernacle. And some of them can be tricky, right? And when you see that tying it out is the problem, what about tying your shoes? What about untying your shoes? So, of course, there's a larger conversation as to what exactly it means. For example, they talk about it being a permanent knot. Well, if it's not a permanent knot, you can tie it and untie it. I don't know about you, but I can't stand tying my shoes in a permanent knot because then I can never untie them. So here you have the opportunity to look at, some of these things and how they applied in the tabernacle, as well as how these laws are being transmitted. These 39 categories of prohibited activity on Shabbat are a perfect example of the oral tradition. Right? When we talk about Judaism, we talk about the Torah. The Torah is written down. And we also talk about the Talmud. Now, the Talmud, people think it's the rabbis. Now, that is correct. The rabbis are in the Talmud, but the Talmud is the writing down of the oral tradition. Oral tradition is not only the words and teachings of the rabbis, but there's an oral tradition that goes back to when the Torah was given at Sinai. So, for example, it says, observe Shabbat and do no malacha. Those categories of malacha were described and listed with specificity orally. Right? If you need to kind of picture it, Moses came after speaking to God at the top of Mount Sinai, and he started teaching Torah. And some of it was written down into the Torah that we write, into our Chumash, and some of it was orally transmitted. It was written down, observe Shabbat, don't do any malacha. And Moses, people obviously said, so what's malacha? And Moses says, funny that you should ask. Let me tell you what they all are. And he listed all the 39. And I guess, they had better memories than we did, and they were able to remember them without them having been written down. And that was an oral tradition. It remained oral until the rabbis around the year 200, so some 1800 years ago, realized that this is not going well. Even back then, they started recognizing the early onset of attention deficit disorder and shorter attention spans. And they realized that people would no longer be capable of passing on the entirety of Jewish tradition orally. So they wrote down those oral traditions. And some of those oral traditions are biblical rules that have been transmitted orally until being written down in the Talmud. And so these 39 categories of work are an example of that. Another example of that, just so, it's things that you sometimes think must be written in the Torah and they're written there somewhere, or if it's not written in the Torah, maybe it's not real obligatory Judaism. So for example, in addition to the 39 categories of work, which were part of the oral tradition, we talk about people not eating a cheeseburger, right? Can't eat milk and meat. So you should know that the Torah never says you cannot eat milk and meat together. The Torah says that you cannot cook a kid in its mother's milk. And it happens to say that in the Torah written down 3 separate times. And there's the oral tradition that the 3 separate times are there so that to teach that you can't cook milk and meat together, you can't eat milk and meat cooked together, and you can't derive benefit, like sell milk and meat cooked together. So that's part of the oral tradition. And it gets extended that for example, what about waiting in between eating meat and milk? That's a rabbinic law added on to that oral tradition. So when we study about Shabbat, we're talking about the things that we don't do on Shabbat. Well, one of the things to keep in mind is that Shabbat provides us with a very significant opportunity of engaging with Jewish study, the origins of Jewish tradition, the process of Jewish tradition. That also lends to the significant nature of Shabbat being a major part of observant Judaism. So those were the next 13. The next 7 had to do with processing animal hides for the covering of the Mishkan. In addition to the walls and the partitions, there also was the roof of the Mishkan, which had animal skins that were processed. Well, guess what? Those were trapping, slaughtering, skinning, tanning, ruling lines, scraping hides, cutting to size or shape. So, for example, one of the extensions of the cutting size to shape, there's certain rules about not cutting things into tiny pieces on Shabbat. When it comes to trapping, some of this can extend over into how we treat pets on Shabbat. But again, these are the categories, and then the traditions and the rules developed beyond that. We'll see some examples soon. Now, in addition, the boards which served as a framework for the Mishkan were written on to indicate which board fit into the other. Because remember, we said the Mishkan was a traveling tabernacle sanctuary. So they would put it together and take it apart. Well, if anyone's ever had any experience putting things together and taking them apart and wanting to put them back together, you need to label what goes where, and that's what they would do. So therefore, writing and erasing are also problematic things. When the next 2 were performed when setting them up and removing them from their bases, building and demolishing, very broad categories. Building, is it building a real building? What about a model building? What about Legos? The final hammer blow that completes the process, make bepatish, final hammer blow. Now, you think the final hammer blow doesn't require a hammer. Maybe this is something that's problematic by taking an unusable object and making it usable. And that is the final hammer blow. Then there is malacha relating to the fire under the kettle used for the making of the dyes or the making of the charcoals. So you're not allowed to extinguish and you're not allowed to light a fire. And then there's you're not allowed to carry things back and forth. You're not allowed to move an object from one domain to the other. So we have found that these 39 categories of work were part and parcel of the preparation, construction, implementation of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. Hence, we get our 39 malachot. I think we'll stop here. If anyone has some questions or comments, again, we're going to go a little bit more deeply into this in the next section, but it's a pretty good place to stop if anyone wants to ask anything. All right, everybody good? Yes, Sasha.
Yeah, just one question. The separating the bad from the good. Can you say something? I'm a little confused about that.
Right, you're not allowed to separate the bad from the good because part of the preparation of the wheat and the flour meant separating the wheat from the chaff. So you're not allowed to separate bad things from good things. For example, this can go extending, we're not going to go into all the details here now, but this could be something, for example, if you have a whole pile of clothes, you can't pick out the ones you want to throw away. I don't know why you have to do that on Shabbos, although sometimes, it's a really long Friday night or really long Saturday afternoon, you got nothing else to do. You want to take out the good from the bad. You have to make the pile of things you want to save. Or, for example, if you have silverware which was washed and it's a big pile, you can't take away that which you want to put away. You can take what you want to use. These will be the quarter of 2 examples where where it might come up in terms of the separating. But again, as with many rules, for example, when it comes to doing this for food preparation, there are different rules that may apply. Again, we're not able to go into all of the depth of the details of all the specifics, but the general, you can't take the bad from the good. That's why we gave the example before, watermelon seeds from the watermelon, picking bones out of fish, those kinds of things.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
It's Howard. I don't see a strong argument for using the malacha of the tabernacle to bring that to explaining the restrictions on Shabbat. What is the argument that should be the source?
So there's no argument. This is an oral tradition. When God commanded the tabernacle these were the instructions for the tabernacle. And God then said, what you're doing to construct the tabernacle, which consisted of all of these 39 categories were transmitted orally, it was told you cannot do that on Shabbat. And so it's not necessarily, it's not about arguments. It's about this. These are the categories of activity which were prohibited on Shabbat. We just don't have a delineated list of them until they were collected and written down in the Talmud.
Okay.
And so it becomes if you want to delve a little bit more into the vagary of it all, right? We know we can, we said at the beginning, at the outset, that whatever you do during the week, don't do on Shabbat. That will cover a lot of these things. It may cover too many of those things, as we'll see. Right? During the week is when I cook. Well, I won't cook on Shabbat. Okay. During the week is when I write, so I won't write on Shabbat. A lot of these things may work that way as well, but there will not be enough specificity if we apply it to that. And people will say, well, I read on Shabbat. I read them during the week, so I can't read on Shabbat. And so between these two general origin stories for prohibiting what's called milacha, whether it be not to do what we do during the week, or the oral tradition connecting the types of work that we don't do on Shabbat to the types of work that were part of the Mishkan process and forbidden directly by the Torah on Shabbat, that begins to provide us with certainly a healthy dose of things that we can't do on Shabbos. And those details are quite robust, and we're going to see they extend way beyond just the 39 examples. Because if we look farther into some of the lingo, it's not just malachot, those activities themselves, right? We're up to Roman numeral number 4. There's also tolda, an offspring, an act that resembles a malacha in that it is actually the same principle of creation, though in another form. Example, threshing is separating the grain from its husk is a malacha, while squeezing fruit for its liquid is a tolda. Practically speaking, this is also a Torah prohibition, just different terminology and origins. Right? We're going deeper into the oral tradition, right? So you're not allowed to separate the grain from the husk. That's one of the direct categories. An extension of that, also biblically prohibited, is to take the liquid, squeezing liquid from fruit for juicing purposes. We'll go a little bit further through some of the language, and if you have any questions, just hold on to them till we make it through some more of the language. Then we have a Gezera. A Gezera is an act prohibited by the rabbis to safeguard a Torah prohibition. Right? We sometimes even encounter within Judaism this idea of the fence. Right? So one of the classic fences of Shabbat, and we'll talk, we'll approach it in more detail later, is muktzah. Muktzah, it refers to items which have no Shabbat utility, can't be carried, can't be moved, right? There's nothing intrinsically wrong in holding a pen. You can't write with the pen. So to ensure that I don't write with the pen, the rabbi says I can't even move or carry a pen. Same thing with money. Money is not intrinsically, what's wrong with money? It's paper. But since what people do with money, they'll take the money and buy things, the rabbi said, don't touch the money, because you may end up buying things. Takana. A takana is a rule, an enactment that the rabbis make in order to uphold the spirit of the Torah's laws. So, these are rules that are made to make Shabbat more consistent, or to create a more holistic Shabbat. So, for example, one takana, the idea, for example, of making Kiddush on Saturday, Shabbat day Kiddush, is not understood as a biblical origin law. The rabbis felt, well, you're making it Friday, so you should also make it on Saturday. It's a rabbinic rule, but it's not there to protect us from doing the wrong thing. It's encouraging us in a way to hopefully do the right thing. When it comes to violating Shabbat, we talk about words like chayav. Chayav means liable, right? People say, so what happens if you break Shabbat, right? The whole idea of consequence is not something that we lead with that, break Shabbat and such will happen, but technically there's liability. And so, for example, in certain types of violating Shabbat would lead to the death penalty. Of course, the death penalty is a larger issue in Jewish law, which was generally never employed or utilized or hardly ever. But the idea is that, or sometimes a sacrifice would have to be brought. Sometimes the rabbis would institute certain punishments to keep the public order, right? If too many people would break Shabbat on certain rabbinic laws, the rabbis may bring about law and order to try, whether it be to fine people or the like, to make things run more smoothly. Patur aval asur. People always say, well, if there's no punishment, then I'm allowed to do it. And that's not the case. As it says, commonly called patur, this indicates that the act is forbidden, but the violator is not liable for punishment. Action forbidden by the rabbis to safeguard violating a Torah prohibition. It's one of those things that, well, if I'm not going to be punished for it, then maybe I should still be allowed to do it. Judaism doesn't work that way. I may not be punishing you, but that still doesn't mean you're allowed to do it. It's still forbidden. And some activities are just mutar. They are straight up permitted. So these are some of the terms that you'll encounter within the laws of Shabbat. Elsewhere in Judaism also, something to keep in mind is that in practical Judaism, whether something is biblical or rabbinic in its origin, the level of requirement is still there. We don't say, oh, the rabbi said to do it, so I don't have to do it, right? That's an important rule when you're talking to a rabbi like me. Just because they're, oh, rabbi, you're not God, you didn't command it, or it's not written in the Torah, I don't have to do it. In terms of practical Judaism, we treat biblical and rabbinic laws the same. The differences sometimes emerge when there are doubts or when there are other extenuating circumstances. Then we sometimes look at a priority that we prioritize biblical rules or are more careful about biblical rules and rabbinic rules, right? Because you have to listen to God and the rabbis, but if it's a choice between God and the rabbis, even I'm willing to defer to God. So that's something to keep in mind in some of the terminology. That's not only by Shabbat, but other things as well. Any questions on some of the language or some of those concepts before we take it a little bit more deeply in the theory before talking a little bit about practice?
Hi, Rabbi. This is Tyler.
Hey.
I have a real quick question. So, can you carry money for charity purposes on Shabbat only?
Right. Okay. So the short answer is no.
Okay.
Money is muktzah. You can't carry it.
Okay.
Sometimes they'll talk about extenuating circumstances. First off, you're not allowed to carry outside. What if there's what's called the eruv, the enclosure that allows you to carry?
Mhm.
Okay, so we take care of that. But so a more compelling reason to carry would be, let's say you live in a dangerous neighborhood that if you get mugged and you don't have any money, they're going to kill you.
Yeah.
Hopefully no one's living in those types of neighborhoods. but suffice it to say, these types of questions can be asked and dealt with. Contemporary society makes things a little bit trickier because who has money anymore? We have credit cards. Most of the time we don't have credit cards anymore. We have Apple Pay. I don't know, maybe some of you got a lot of Bitcoin. That was a good investment if you do. But because it was really mostly about transaction. And it wasn't really about, it was about transaction, and it wasn't really about the money itself. You're not allowed to transact on Shabbat. And the transaction was really about writing, because usually if there was a transaction that was made, it would have to be recorded and things written down. And that's a biblical prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll give a couple examples of that in a minute. Yes, Alexandra.
So can I carry my sitter to shul on Shabbos on Saturday? Like, is that allowed?
Right. So if you live in an area that is enclosed by what's called the eruv is the Jewish religious boundary enclosure. So if you're living in, most parts of if you're living in many neighborhoods in Manhattan, the answer is yes. If you're living in middle of nowhere, Wyoming, the answer would be no, or most likely no. It's one of the areas of Jewish law that has become far less focused upon, because most observant Jews are living in areas that have an eruv. Well, that was not always the case. If you go back, let's say 30 years ago, there were plenty of people who had to make do. Put the key under their mat, find other mechanisms to go around it. But nowadays, most times, observant Jews are living in places where there's an Eruv. In some places, that's the only way a community will continue to attract observant Jews, is if they're able to make it work for them this way. But so if you're living in Upper East, Upper West, Midtown, that kind of thing, you're good to go. If you have a specific question, you can let me know. Anybody else? So let's dig a little more deeply into some of the thinking and the rationale behind this, because the differences between the origins and whether something is malacha or tolda or biblical or rabbinic, like I said, comes into play when there are competing circumstances or extenuating circumstances. And so that's why it's important to recognize that there are certain conditions for a malacha to apply, that for a person to violate, for it to really be considered a wholehearted violation. You have to really know what's going on. So for example, this is Roman numeral number 5 in the sources, awareness. A person must be aware that a forbidden act is being performed. So there's a certain knowledge level that a person has to have before one is really held accountable and liable and responsible for Shabbat. In Hebrew, there's a term Talmid Chacham, which means wise man, scholar. There's a term apikoros, which is used to describe a heretic. And there's an expression that goes, you have to really be a Talmid Chacham to be an apikoros. You have to be a scholar to be a heretic, because if you're not a scholar, you're just an ignoramus. So you're not a heretic if you don't know what you're doing, you're just ignorant. So in order to really rebel and deny, and then you have to really know your stuff. And the same is true with Shabbat. You have to be aware of what's wrong and do it anyway for it to be a complete violation of a malacha. Not only that, there has to be intent. You have to have done the act in order to violate Shabbat. So for example, sometimes, as you see there in B1, an action which never leads to malacha, sometimes beneficial, sometimes detrimental, sometimes inconsequential. For example, refrigerators have lights that sometimes turn on. Let's say I open a refrigerator and the light turns on. Well, when I opened the refrigerator, all I wanted to happen was the door to open, but the light turned on. So that's not something I can do, and it is important to be sensitive and careful about turning refrigerator lights off on Shabbat and not turning them on, but you're not fully liable for violating Shabbat when you opened up that door, because you did not open that door to turn on a light. You opened that door to do what? Open the door. So therefore, it's not a full violation. Also, this extension in going further, C, for the purpose. The act must be done for the sake of the malacha. For example, digging a hole to get dirt is not a malacha. Digging a hole to have a hole is. Now, just because it's not a malacha still doesn't make it permissible. But again, we're trying to uncover, using the digging in the hole pun intended, what is really at the heart of the Shabbat violation. D, conventionally, malacha is only permitted it's only considered malacha if it's performed in the usual fashion. And this is where we encounter what's called the shinui if done differently. So for example, turning on a light switch with my finger is conventional. Striking a match usually is conventional. Turning on a light switch using a banana as the object which flips on the light switch is not conventional. It's done with a shinui. You may have encountered this, especially those who are familiar with Manhattan. One of the things that is, how do you, in Manhattan, if you live on a high floor, how do you get up the steps? So you have to push an elevator button. So some would say, well, I'm not going to push the button. I'm going to use my elbow to push the button, or I'm going to push you into the button or something like that. So that doesn't make it right, but it's only a full malacha violation if it's done in its conventional way. Has to be directly. The act must be directly produced to malacha. So it actually has to be It can't be indirect. It has to be direct. So if flicking the switch sets in motion the next action and then turns on the light, that's indirect. For example, this came into discussion with regards to when you turn the ignition on a car. When you turn the ignition on a car, are you lighting the engine? Are you firing up the engine, or are you turning the ignition mechanism, which then does the lighting for you? And this is relevant, especially in conservative Judaism, where they issued permission to drive to shul on Shabbat in the 1950s. Right? Conservative Judaism, some people think, oh, they just don't observe anything. That's not true. Conservative Judaism is halachic Judaism. They follow Jewish law. They just sometimes incorporate or allow for changes based on the situation. Part of the permission was, hey, just because you get into the car and turn this key, you're not lighting the fire. You're doing something that's starting the process of lighting the fire. Manpower efficiency: the fewest number of people must do the act. If one person can carry the object, but two do the carrying, it's not a malacha. So let's say you're carrying your sitter and there's no eruv, but two people carry the sitter. Well, only takes one to do it. So if two people are doing it, it's not a full violation. It's still forbidden, but it's not a full violation of the act. Has to be constructive. There has to be constructive result. It has to be permanent. And there has to be quantitative significance. There's a minimum quantity to be liable. So for example, one of the things that comes up with writing is, what if you write with invisible ink? Disappearing ink. And this is something they actually do in Israel. In Israel, you have to remember, a lot of these issues are dealt with much more throughout, life's experiences. You have a lot of Jewish doctors. Well, you could say for medical purposes it's essential, but not everything that's being written down is essential to save human life. So in hospitals, especially in those hospitals which have a higher percentage of Jews, you have to remember there are plenty of Arab workers in a number of hospitals, but also Jews and observant Jews. They use disappearing ink that doesn't last for 24 hours. And after Shabbat, there is the mad rush to rewrite everything. They actually do this in the army. I know one of the worst jobs in the army is to have to rewrite everything after Shabbat, because the notes were taken over Shabbat in ink that will not last for 24 hours, and someone else has to take care of it afterwards. Or for example, you talk about quantitative significance. Writing, you can't write anything on Shabbat, but you have to write a certain minimum amount for it to be considered a violation of Shabbat. So writing one letter is not enough for writing one letter is not enough to violate the malacha. You have to write two, but still you're not allowed to do. It's still forbidden. It's just not a violation of malacha. Just one other example of shinoi: you're not allowed to write in your usual hand. But if you're right-handed and you write with your left hand, that's considered a shinoi. You're not allowed to do it, but it's not a full violation because you're doing it differently. And that's why it's important, as you see there in bold at the end of Roman numeral number 5, it may still be prohibited, even if not a malacha. But we can end up with some very, very unique situations that, when there may be, other compelling circumstances can create unique situations on Shabbat. I'll mention one of the strangest that I've ever encountered, where Shabbat should not be, obviously can never be violated, but if we look at this hierarchy of violations, maybe we can find a situation where some violation might be tolerated. Let's see if everybody can follow this one. This is one of my favorites. As we know, and I think most people on this call, if not everybody, is on the Eastern time zone. The issue of the dateline can really make things even more complicated. Right? It's one thing to be hours ahead or hours behind, but what about the dateline? And so, of course, in true Jewish fashion, there are different opinions on the dateline. The easiest and most commonly followed view is that the Jewish dateline follows the dateline. Right? One dateline is enough. However, there are certain views which would put Japan on the other side of the dateline, which is not where it is based on the international dateline. And the way that would then happen is that Saturday in Japan is really Friday, and Sunday is Saturday. The position of the date line makes it fall out that way. So there was once there was a group of yeshiva students from Yeshiva University who took they had an educational trip to Japan. And the question is, so what would they do? So many just felt, look, most of the Jewish world follows the regular date line, and it's Saturday in Japan, it's Saturday for them, and that's the Shabbos. But this is Yeshiva University. These are students, modern students who are trying to apply Jewish law. So they decided to be careful for the opinion that Sunday would really be Saturday, and that would also be Shabbos. They kept 2 days of Shabbos. So what did that mean they did? So they didn't have Shabbos meals on both days. They celebrated Shabbat on Saturday, but they were careful for the violations of Shabbat on both Saturday and Sunday. However, that can be pretty onerous. So they were only careful for the biblical violations of Shabbat on the Sunday, which they were treating as Saturday. All right, so you follow? They have celebrated a full Shabbat on Saturday, and on Sunday, they were careful not to violate the biblical malachot rules that we just discussed. So one of the things that was permitted by the group, the rabbi and the group said, is that they're allowed to go shopping, because the only reason we don't transact on Shabbos is because you might write. So wait a second, isn't that still a problem? You say you can shop on Shabbos, and if you have to write with your other hand. Because again, they were being careful about the biblical rules of that possible Shabbat, which for everyone else was Sunday. So they were only worried about that, writing with your left hand or writing one letter, and muktzah things and rabbinic rules, they didn't worry about on that day because there is a hierarchy. So I bring that as an example to round out the discussion of conceptually the rules of Shabbat. When we say that you can't do something, practically speaking, you can't do it. However, it's important to understand the depth of background that exists with all of these rules of Shabbat. And there is a difference, and a full flagrant violation requires all of the details that we saw. And there could be situations where we would differentiate between biblical and rabbinic and full and partial and intentional and less intentional, and doing things with a shino. We would never tolerate those on Shabbos, but there is a situation in the modern world where where it could be utilized, a calculation like they did on that Yeshiva University trip. So I hope some of you appreciated that. I'm happy to stop and take some questions before we go a little bit more granularly, practically speaking, into some of the more common practical situations of the laws of Shabbat.
Rabbi, hi, this is Dave Rosner and Elizabeth.
Hey.
We were wondering, what were the repercussions for a full violation versus a shinui?
No, so the shinoi violation, is not, the repercussions are not there. It's, it's a black mark, an extra atonement necessary on Yom Kippur, a spiritual element. You wouldn't end up with the execution or sacrifice or spiritually being cut off from the Jewish nation. Yep. Anybody else? So I think, again, I think that on some level you could possibly suggest that, why spend time on this and make it just about, follow the laws, and why point out that there's a larger system behind it? I think there's a couple of reasons. One, it's intellectually honest to talk about the totality of the Torah's system and understanding of Shabbat. That's reason number one. Two, it is important to recognize that all situations are not the same. Someone who's stuck, on the 75th floor of a building and needs to get down and has it's not necessarily an emergency, but needs to get down and is getting a little anxious, using the elbow is better than pushing the button. It's important to recognize the more complicated nature of all of this. Yes, hand up, Alexandra.
I have another question. So you mentioned before turning the ignition to the car. so even if I wasn't turning the ignition to the car, I'm still not allowed to be a passenger in a car.
So, there we would identify, how'd you get in the car? When you open the car door, did you turn a light on? There are all sorts of other steps that need to be analyzed. As an example, there was a proposal made once that in the community that they should have what's called a Shabbos bus. And the way they address this is that it was free. It stopped at every stop regardless of anyone being there, because remember, if the bus is stopping for you, then you're the cause of the gas, of the mechanism of the brake working, and then gas going into the engine when he hits the gas. You can't have that either. So it was it was on a permanent loop that stopped at every stop, and you never had to pay. And then the only question is added weight. Does added weight lead to more fuel burning? And is that a problem or not? Suffice it to say that the Shabbos was in a sense rejected by most, only because it's not in the spirit of Shabbos. Remember, we said at the very beginning, there's two ways to get to these malachot. One is through the tabernacle. The other is whatever you do during the week, don't do on Shabbos. And even though that's not a technical catch-all for all the prohibited activity on Shabbat, there's this idea that it's not in the spirit of Shabbos to do certain things. And it's a broad subject, and that is complex. As I often say, it's a slippery slope, and you need very sturdy shoes to navigate the slippery slope. And Jewish law is very sensitive to that. And so something like that would probably be not utilized because of the slippery slope. But that's the issue of getting into the car. It can take us down that route also.
Thank you.
Sure. So let's just talk about a couple of these categories, and then we'll have some time for questions. And then, like I said, next week we'll really, we'll get granular. And I certainly encourage any practical observance questions of Shabbos to be thought about. We're coming up on Shabbos. This Shabbos, any questions you have about how this is being observed, take note, and we can certainly, you can email them to me during the week, or we can cover them next week. So muksa, it's muksa, and we talked about how muksa is just one of those categories in source Roman numeral 6, prohibition against moving items that would or should remain unused on Shabbat. This would protect against accidentally carrying them outside, prevent accidental use of prohibited items, maintain the spirit of Shabbat. Different types of muksa, expensive items not used on Shabbat, items prohibited to be used on Shabbat, items that have no use on Shabbat, right? They can be designated for use on Shabbat, right? Usually you don't need rocks and stones, but if you want to designate it to be a paperweight, if you're going to have a picnic, you want to hold down the blanket, it's one thing. One may also not move any item upon which a muksa item rests. A tray with Shabbat candles, even after Shabbat candles go out, is problematic. Muksa items may sometimes be moved in an indirect fashion, or if the space they occupy is needed, or to preserve the object. And this is obviously a very brief summary. The idea generally is if it has no Shabbat purpose, you can't move it. If it holds on to something that has no Shabbat purpose, you can't move the thing that it's on. If there's great need to utilize the space, then it could be moved. For example, they talk about if you have a tray that had Shabbat candles lit. Now the candles are not lit, but you want to move the tray. You should also put some food on the tray, because when you move the tray, you're not moving the candles, you're moving the food and the candles. So again, there are workarounds that are reflection of the need for Shabbat to function, as well as being sensitive to that which is prohibited. On page 4 of our sources, cooking on Shabbos. Bottom line is don't. However, there are a number of rules and principles that are there. One, bishul is you're not allowed a biblical prohibition of cooking includes not limited to finishing off the cooking baking of a food, cooking solid food to the point of 1/3 to 1/2 cooked, heating of cold liquid above 120 degrees, right? That's why Shabbat begins beforehand when you cook the food. However, you are allowed to reheat on Shabbat as long as you're not violating any of these principles, as well as the next two, especially the idea of returning food to the flame can't be done. That's why many people just take the easy way out and don't have hot food on Saturday. That actually is not in the spirit of Shabbos, because The idea is to have food that, more robust, heartier meals. Again, I think a lot of it has to do with culinary tastes. More people today are more tolerant of cold food than maybe once upon a time. It's like, meals used to have bread. My grandfather always had bread at the meals. Who's eating bread anymore? Carbs. You don't have that. But the idea of being so there has certainly been some changes, and being careful about it is helpful. Now here too we have a situation. Cholent. Cholent is not only a food that people enjoy, but it's a type of food that you put it up on Friday, you leave it cooking until Saturday afternoon, and you don't have to worry. You have hot food. You have something that has to have ingredients that can be slow cooked and cooked for a very long time. So that's with some of the laws of cooking. The last thing I just want to touch upon is that if a Jew can't do something on Shabbos, the Jew can't ask the non-Jew to do it. Right. So, this is meant to preserve the sanctity of the day, because otherwise every Jew would just get hold of a non-Jew, and then their Shabbos would be like a regular weekday. However, there are exceptions, and it's important to ask about those exceptions. Some general categories are for heat and light purposes. Like classically throughout Jewish history, it's going to be dark. It's going to be cold. Having the non-Jew light the fire, light the stove was important. Having the non-Jew cook an omelet for Saturday morning breakfast, not important, right? You have to, there's certain priorities. Also in terms of things to perform, to celebrate Shabbat and perform a mitzvah effectively. So for example, a Jew can't ask a non-Jew what a non-Jew can't do themselves. However, to help perform a mitzvah, it could be an exception. And remember, what is the Jew asking the non-Jew to do? There's a big difference between the Jew asking a non-Jew to strike a match and push a button on an elevator. They're very different violations of the laws of Shabbat. Striking a match is kindling a fire, which is an absolute biblical prohibition. Pushing an elevator button can be very, very different. And we don't have time to necessarily go into the specificity of it. We can maybe talk about that next week with some contemporary examples, but it's a very different violation. So, I think that very often when it comes to the don'ts of Shabbat these days, often it's the cooking and it's the writing, and it's the carrying of the muktzah items, which are the significant observances. So we touched upon those more specifically, and happy to round out the evening with some questions. And like I said, happy to go more deeply into these questions in our last session next week. Who's planning a trip to Japan to do that second day of Shabbos? Anybody? After COVID, maybe? We'll see. All right. It's been a pleasure studying with you, and I look forward to our conclusion of this course next week.
Thank you.